Good evening, everybody. Welcome to East and West Learning Connections. I'm Yang Wang, the founder and president of the organization, your tonight's host. And we have Christina Wang with us as a co-host. She is a grade 11 student in Toronto. She'll be recording this session and give us this technical support. And also, I believe she has some questions from the youth group from our community for our guest speakers. We are a federally registered nonprofit organization. We bring learning, communicating, and volunteering opportunities to the public, especially for the immigrant communities. And we help people of different heritages to overcome cultural barriers and get connected. Tonight, I'm very much honored to be joined by two remarkable Canadians as our guest speakers in this East and West Dialogue, a monthly program we run. Our guest speakers come over as volunteers to share their life stories, their thoughts, concerns, and suggestions with immigrants. We are very much grateful to them to volunteer their time and expertise and to help us get to know more about Canadian culture, the people and customs here, and to promote that communications between people of different cultural backgrounds. Our esteemed guest speakers tonight are George, Elliott, Clarke, and Rosemary Sadlier. George, Elliott, Clarke, and Rosemary Sadlier, they both wear many hats and have received many awards. Just to name a few, George is a Canadian National Poet Laureate. He is a professor at University of Toronto and a pioneer scholar of African Canadian literature. He has received the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellows Prize and the Governor General's Award for Poetry, among other awards. He is also the appointee to the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada. And Rosemary Sadlier is a social activist, an international speaker, an educator, researcher on Black history, anti-racism, and women's issues. She is the former president of the Ontario Black History Society for 22 years, and she is the driving force to secure the commemoration of February as a National Black History Month, and also August 1st as the Emancipation Day. She is also the author of 7 books on Canadian, like African Canadian history. She is the appointee to the Order of Ontario. Welcome, Rosemary. Welcome, George. Thank you so much for joining us in this dialogue.
Thank you, Yang. It's so good to be part of this evening with Rosemary.
It's a real honor to share the stage with you, George. And thank you so very much, Yang, for inviting me to your group.
Oh, thank you so much. Before I turn it over to you, let me welcome our participants and thank them again. So most of us, I know we're Torontonians, but I do know people from Alberta, from Shanghai, China, and from Sydney, Australia. So welcome again for joining George and Rosemary in this dialogue. In the first half of this dialogue, Rosemary and George will do presentations, and then Christina and I we collect some questions from our community. So we'll ask a couple of questions to our guest speakers, then we'll open the floor for everybody. So at that point, you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and turn on your video to talk to our guest speakers. And also you're welcome to send in your questions in the chat room. So if our guest speakers do not pick them up, Christina will take care of that and ask your questions to our guest speakers. So now let's begin to listen and discuss to our guest speakers. So now over to you, George. Would you like to start? Would you like to do it first?
Okay, Yang. Thank you so much. For how long should I speak? I don't want to go on too long.
Oh, so if you want me to keep a time for you, I'll remind you around like in 20 minutes. Is that okay?
Oh, that's plenty of time. Okay, I'll try to keep things as interesting as possible moving along. So I know that members of the East-West Learning Club are very interested in knowing about the experiences of Black Canadians, or sometimes we call ourselves African Canadians and African Ontarians and African Nova Scotians and so on. And that's really important to me. I'm touched by your interest because of the fact that, and Rosemary can speak to this too, we have centuries of presence in Canada. And so deep knowledge of how this society has been historically towards people of color, and specifically African Canadians, as well as Indigenous people. And so even right now in 2021, when I hear people talk about racism as if it's something that's brand new, or as if aspects of Black history, Indigenous history, Asian Canadian history, Chinese Canadian history is all somehow strange and mysterious. What that tells me is that the powers that be have continued to do a very good job of obscuring, of hiding the real truth about the structures of Canadian society. I should continue by talking a little bit about my roots, my heritage. Specifically, this is the world's second largest country now. And so that means we have Black communities and major Black communities all across Canada. But I'm from the historical Black community in Nova Scotia, whose roots go back to the very first Black person that we know of to set foot on soil that we now consider to be part of Canada. And I'm thinking of Mathieu Da Costa, who was an interpreter for Champlain with Indigenous people, with the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. And he was from Portugal, actually, but somehow he managed to hook up with Champlain, arrived at Port Royal, Annapolis Royal now, in Nova Scotia in 1605. And he must have been really good with languages, because immediately he has the job of trying to figure out Mi'kmaq, the Mi'kmaq tongue, and to be able to communicate between the French sailors and settlers, as they're going to be, and the Indigenous people. Well, that was his job. And so my community in Nova Scotia starts with that first historical person. But Black people didn't really begin to be present in Nova Scotia until 1713. And the reason why I can say that date specifically is because New France, which is the root of Quebec and also of Acadie and Francophone cultures in Canada, Nouvelle France, as an entity of France, as an empire entity, in what later becomes Canada, practiced slavery. To make a long story short, in fact, most Canadians don't know what most of you are now going to know, which is that slavery was practiced in the 5 eastern colonies of what is now Canada, 5 eastern colonies. They were Ontario, Quebec, what is now Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. And here's another fact that a lot of people don't know. The province or colony that had the largest number of slaves was Quebec when it was New France. And the numbers were about 5,000. And here's another fact. The majority of the slaves in Quebec were actually Indigenous people. They were Pawnee. So the numbers break down in this way. Basically, roughly 2,000 Black slaves of African heritage, and 3,000 Indigenous people, Pawnee people, were held as slaves by the French settlers in what later becomes Quebec. But slavery was also practiced in Nova Scotia, as I was just indicating. And so we know that slaves are being held at Fortress Louisbourg by 1713 because there was a census taken. And so there are hundreds of slaves in what is now Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, held in what was then Fortress Louisbourg, and it's now a National Historic Park. Fast forward from 1713 to 1760, that date is important because 1760 is when Fortress Louisbourg was destroyed by the British, but it's also the same year that Yankees came up from New England and of course from the South, what is now the United States. It was still all British America at that point, but in 1760, American, or people who are going to become American, Yankee settlers move into Nova Scotia in 1760, and they bring hundreds of slaves with them who are used to farm, or used as servants. And so the Black people from Louisbourg and the Black people who arrive in 1760 are the real historical Black population in Nova Scotia. Later on, during the American Revolution, we have the arrival of Black loyalists, and these were roughly 3,500 people. 75% of them were free, and they got settled all around mainland Nova Scotia, not Cape Breton, but mainland Nova Scotia. Briefly, a place called Birchtown, which is near the town of Shelburne on the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, was briefly the largest free Black community in all of North America. That's in 1783. So again, just keep track of the dates: 1713, 1760, 1783. And then during the War of 1812, another 2,200 Black Americans end up in Nova Scotia. And so that's why until roughly the early 1960s, Nova Scotia had the largest concentration of Black people in Canada. And also very important, excuse me again, even though Black settlers were given the worst land deliberately, and this is important to understand because a lot of immigrants coming to Canada look at Black communities and see that there are poor people, there are unemployed people, and they say, oh, what's wrong with you that you didn't have a better economic situation? Since you've been here 200, 300 years, why aren't you better off? The truth of the matter is that everybody was given the worst land deliberately so they could not become independent farmers. This is important because until the Industrial Revolution in late 18th century into the 19th century, the entire world economy was based on agriculture. So if you didn't have land, you could not farm. And this is true for poor peasant populations everywhere, all around the world. If you're a part of a peasant class, meaning you don't own your own land, meaning that you might have to work somebody else's land, you are guaranteed perpetual poverty. That's why revolutions occurred all over the world in order to overthrow the landlord class and bring in the possibility of people to have enough land in order to enjoy an economic takeoff for themselves. Black Canadians, my ancestors, were not allowed to have enough land to become economically independent, self-sufficient. It was by deliberate government policy, colonial government policy, that Black people were supposed to be kept poor so that we would do all the dirty work, all the dangerous work, and also denied schooling so that we could not pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We would have to be working people working for white employers and never have a chance to really accumulate any wealth of our own. And so that's why even just today, March 26, 2021, there was a news story on CBC Radio Tonight that one town in the United States is actually paying reparations, paying money to Black citizens to make up for the years of discrimination and slavery. I gotta say this really simply. The reason why slavery was so important, I know this is so obvious, it's so simple, but the reason why slavery was so important is because you needed to have a mass of people to do the farming and to do the mining in order to build up the wealth of the so-called New World, Turtle Island, to use the term that Indigenous people use. And Black people were thought by Europeans to be the very best group of mass workers in order to create wealth for them. That is why slavery leads to the Renaissance. Slavery leads to the Industrial Revolution. Slavery leads to the Enlightenment. Slavery is the reason why, and imperialism, slavery and imperialism are the reasons why, when we look at the G8 countries, most of the countries in the so-called G8 were slave-holding empires. This is not an accident. The reason why some of the richest countries in the world are rich is because they stole Indigenous people's land, they stole African labor, and they ripped off the resources from Indigenous people's land. This is the truth that does not get taught. And this is why some folks are mystified about why Black people complain. Why do we complain so much about the police and complain so much about having to struggle to get work, to get equal employment, to have our talent recognized, and so on? I got to say this very simply once again. It is just really simple. We have to understand that as much as we can talk about economics and politics and sociology and religion, we also need to accept the truth that Western Europe, in particular, over 500 years between Columbus, 1492, and into the 20th century, deliberately organized the planet. Deliberately. And I'm talking about the Dutch, the French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, deliberately organized the whole planet to support what we now call white supremacy. What is white supremacy? People are, what is that? It sounds like a terrible thing, and it does have terrible effects, but all white supremacy is white affirmative action. That's what it is. That's what it really means. It's white affirmative action. It means that we get the best of everything for ourselves, and the rest of you, who we will demonize or have demonized or marginalized or have marginalized in the past, will have to do whatever you can do for yourselves, help yourselves get even a little bit close to the wealth that we have amassed. And that's important. I haven't even talked about myself. I'm talking about world history here. We need to understand this also in military terms, because once the Spanish and the Portuguese especially used Indigenous peoples in the Americas to dig up gold and copper and silver, precious metals and gems and so on, what did they use? What did they do with that wealth? Yes, they built the great architectural masterpieces of the Renaissance, but they also built armadas. They also built superpower navies so they could go around the world crushing other people and stealing their resources. I'm not saying anything to be opposed to anybody. I like everybody. I don't have an axe to grind, but I do think we need to understand this history. And so when we look at the world today and we say, who are the greatest military powers? The greatest military powers tend to be connected to the countries that got their wealth through slavery, through stealing from Indigenous people, stealing resources of Indigenous people, and creating armed might for themselves. I hope I'm not going on too long here, but I just want to get this little factoid out there too. One reason why World War II happened, as calamitous and as horrible and as evil as it was because the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, and others recognized what Western Europe had done. You can check this out for yourself. Just go back to the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, was the international conference that Germany called to split up Africa peacefully. This is important because you cannot understand 20th century history unless you understand what happened at the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, which happened in Berlin. The reason why that conference is so important is that all of the major world powers attended. Russia was there, Japan was there, Italy was there, of course, Britain was there, France was there, the United States was there. All these countries came to Berlin to figure out how they could peacefully carve up Africa, because they were trying to avoid a war. They were trying to avoid a major war. And so Germany called this conference together of all these major world players to say, you can have that part of Africa. So France got North Africa, Britain got parts of West Africa and parts of Southern Africa, the Congo, Portugal and Spain got their little parts of Africa for themselves. Germany got a little part of Africa. Italy didn't, so I was very dissatisfied. America got Liberia as their part of Africa. All right, so everybody came away from the Berlin Conference. Most people came away from Berlin Conference. Most countries came away thinking, now we're going to be rich too, because we all now have a little bit more. We all now have colonies. And that's coming back to what I was trying to say earlier about why World War II happens. World War II happens because the belligerent powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, wanted their own colonies. That's it, pure and simple. When they looked at world history, they understood that the way that Western Europe got rich, the way that America got rich, was to have colonies where they could suppress the local populations, the native populations, take their resources, Christianize them, teach them European customs and languages and so on, so they, to the extent they would hate themselves, and allow Europe to master them. And that is why the breaking up of the old imperial order after World War II was so important. That is why the independence of India and Pakistan, Chinese achieving independence, other nations, African nations achieving independence after World War II was so important, because it made it less easy for Europe to continue to. I've talked a lot about world history, a little bit about Black history. I hardly have even talked about my own history. So I'll just say this very quickly. And it took me a long time to understand this. And this is true for every single one of us, every single person listening this evening. This is true for each of us. We are often taught history in school, but we're not taught that each and every one of us is a product of history. Each and every one of us is the result of historical forces. Yes, we all make individual choices. We all do. We make individual choices for individual reasons. But those choices are made within a much larger framework that we may not even be aware of national choices, the choices our nations have made, the choices that provinces have made, the choices that cities have made, the choices that the leaders of the nation have made. All of these choices voted on, decided, laws passed, also impact how we progress through our lives and how we live out the history that we've inherited. I think that's really important for us to understand. So Black Canadians, every single Black Canadian is himself, herself, themselves, a living embodiment of histories of struggle, histories of survival, histories of success that the individual may not even be aware of. Because one of the most important things for us to understand is that history itself is the greatest source of knowledge about how our societies are constructed, about how and why we have marginalized populations, because no population gets marginalized overnight. When we look at Indigenous people across Canada and we see that there is poor water supply, we see that there is Indigenous struggle, we see that there is environmental racism, and then we hear government say, we're trying to fix it. We're going to put money here. We're going to put money over there. But the question doesn't ever really get discussed about, well, why are folks in these straits? Why are they in these dilemmas? Does it have anything to do with the fact that your settler forebears took the best land? That your settler forebears said you have to live in places that are economically unsustainable, far away. So I don't want to keep going on and on. I want to hear from Rosemary as well. So I'll just sum up with this very quickly. I myself am the 5th generation born outside slavery. I'm going to say that again. I was born in 1960, but my great grandfather was born in 1874 in Virginia, only 9 years after slavery ended. A lot of us think that slavery is like, oh, wow, it was like a long time ago. 5 generations, that's 100 years. That's 100 years, that's all it is, 100 years. And a lot of people can live to be more than 100 years old. That's almost living memory. So when I appear on the face of the earth, I'm part American, African-American from Virginia. I'm part West Indian, so I have a grandfather who was a sailor from Jamaica. I'm also part Indigenous because on both my mother's and my father's side, I have Indigenous relatives, Cherokee on my mother's side and Mi'kmaq on my father's side. And I probably have a white ancestor somewhere in there too. In fact, and I'm coming to an end, I had my DNA tested a few years ago when I turned 50, which was actually 11 years ago. I don't mind saying that. And it turned out that I have a relative on my father's side who's Northern British, possibly Scottish, possibly Scandinavian. And on my mother's side, I have a relative who's Lebanese. And when I tell this to people, they say, well, how could that be? How could you have a relative who's Scottish and another relative who's Lebanese? And the answer is simple. Slavery, folks, slavery. The Scots, in particular, were slaveholders, the Irish too, along with the English in their colonies in the Americas. And the Lebanese were major traders and slave traders in West Africa. So in my own lineage, as I was saying a moment ago, I am like each and every one of you, a creature of history. The difference between myself and many others is that I bother to learn it. I bother to know it because I understand that it's only by appreciating the history that creates us all that we can ever move towards real reconciliation and real justice and making up for the injustices of the past. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, George. You're a professor of English literature, but you are also a historian. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're a good timekeeper for yourself. You haven't got a chance to talk a lot about yourself yet. I know you have a very interesting family, but now we'll go to Rosemary, and well, maybe you can share a little bit about yourself, your family later when people ask questions. Okay. So Rosemary.
I am unmuting. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And let me add my praise to your presentation, George. It was amazing, as always. And it's maybe a good thing that you did the presentation that you did. You kind of started big picture and came in. And I think my presentation is going to be sort of the opposite. I'm going to start a little bit more with me and go out. And so after all that fun, I wanted to just remind you actually that my pronouns are she and her. We're going to talk roughly about what it means to be an African Canadian, who I am, what the pandemic has meant, and the coronavirus. So the past year has been highly challenging for us all. The many real fears, the real hardships due to the restrictions, the last minute changes, the computer stuff, the personal protective equipment. But I would also say the challenge is in the time it has given all of us in our forced isolation to consider what is important and to wonder about what you might need to know and to be mindful about how to protect yourself, your health, and even your community's health. And certainly that includes the onset of the racial pandemic, when the world witnessed the public execution of a man named George Floyd. Maybe at another time when we are so rushed and engaged in our demanding jobs and social situations, we might feel bad just for a moment and then quickly be drawn into dealing with other responsibilities. But this time, I think it was different for all of us. And I think that for those of us who have been aware of these types of acts of violence, it was time for action. I also think that for those who may not have been as closely connected, that now it was impossible to not see the acts of discrimination, the racially motivated harm, the active inequities in our society. And I say this, and I'm focusing here a little bit more on the Black community because the George Floyd incident was closely timed to the Regis Korshinsky Paquette curious death in the presence of the police, or in the states of another woman, Breonna Taylor, killed as she slept innocently in her own home. The list goes on. It was no longer seen, and it could no longer be seen, as a single bad actor perpetuating these deaths. As people in general were isolating, they again had to wonder what was important in terms of how they are with each other and how those entrusted with our well-being are behaving about race and how we treat others. We had to consider what we need to know about racism. We need to be mindful about how to prepare ourselves and our communities to understand, to be better, to take action, not just towards a clearer future, but how to take on those actions and what they needed to be. Actions towards change, actions towards social justice. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about myself because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. And I was born in Toronto, and educated in the public system. We were the only Black family in our neighborhood, and I was the only Black child in my school, and therefore most of my classes until high school. However, I came to school knowing what the stereotypes were about people who looked like me. And just a quick aside here, when we say Black, we're not talking about what color you actually are. We are talking about knowing that you have ancestry that is from Africa. So I knew that institutions and cultural representations and media and school textbooks and movies and advertising were told everyone that Black people were supposed to be less intelligent, more athletic, highly promiscuous, less beautiful, inarticulate, dishonest, lazy, dirty, and to top it off, having a penchant for watermelon. So as a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, where did I learn who I was supposed to be in the eyes of the world? Where did I learn I learned this through what media was available and in class. Now let me just say that I was fortunate to have had some wonderful teachers, people who affirmed me in my skills, who encouraged my potential. However, this was in a context where there was no representation at all, and in a setting where prejudicial events still took place. I recall having a teacher, while discussing First Nations, tell the entire class to look at me, look at Rosemary, because she was the color of the Indians. This treatment did not consider my needs, but rather the interests of the majority. I was show and tell for the white kids. I was advised that I ought not to go to university and that I should be a secretary, although my fellow classmates with grades as good as mine were advised differently towards university. In high school, I never participated in the fundraisers that used slave auctions. We were also being taught that all Black people were inferior and had smaller brain capacities. Yet there I sat with a rather large head, having to listen to this and somehow negotiate what I knew to be true with what was being offered. Basically, I found myself feeling invisible. And I suspected it affected my self-esteem at a particular point in time. I never saw myself reflected in a positive way, and specifically not in school. Black people were not even a part of Canada. Why, we came to roost after the Underground Railroad, and we all returned to the United States after the Civil War. But here I was, knowing what my own family history was. So I was technically then not only invisible, I wasn't even here, because according to what we were being told, there were no Black people in this country. I was lucky that both of my parents had experienced growing up in Canada. I was lucky to have been encouraged to have pride in being a Black person. I came to understand that things are not always as they seem. I was blessed by my attendance at a Black church, where I saw people who looked like me, and the wide variety of looks and skin tones and their beauty and their music and the competence. And I knew we were here. I knew we had contributed. Whoops, having some fun with my slides. We had contributed, and where am I? Okay, the joys. Both of my parents are Black. My mother, the descendant of those who came to Southern Ontario on the Underground Railroad, probably about 1830 or so, and remained in Canada, building up communities, churches, schools, and owning property. My father was a descendant of the Black Loyalists, actually is a descendant of all of the first waves of migration of Africans to Canada. The Black Loyalists, the late Loyalists, the refugees of the War of 1812. I was very familiar with my mother's Ontario heritage and some family members and the places that they lived, but it was not until I was married and had 2 of my 3 children that I was able to visit New Brunswick, where my father's family came from. And it was sobering. Sobering to see what Black people had, to see the beautiful and affluent community of Rothsay, and to see the much less affluent areas of Willow Grove, Loch Lomond, and Elm Hill, or what remains of them. I was really left with the question, how had these two groups of people developed so differently? How is it that they both worked so hard in the same area for the same number of generations, yet did not have comparable lifestyles? Many incidents also took place in relation to my children. The time I took my oldest out for Halloween in our neighborhood, and a neighborhood resident demanded to know if we lived there before she would give us any candy. Or my oldest child being the only one in her class not invited to a friend's birthday party. Why? Even though this was her best friend. Why? Because there were not enough chairs. Or the white neighbor, who I thought was a family friend, who called me over to her home early one morning and asked me if I noticed anything. So it turned out her SUV had been stolen during the night. And she assumed that I had done it or that I would know something about it. I had my own SUV. She was a teacher and later went on to be a principal in the Toronto District School Board. So I've shared some of my personal experiences with you in an effort to demonstrate how challenging it was to be the only Black child in my school setting, how challenging it is to be an adult interacting with others, and how disappointing it was to identify a family friend, and this is just one example, there are so many, but a family friend, a neighbor, a home where I had allowed my children to have play dates who clearly had views about people of African descent, which were toxic. I have shared this with you because if not for the luck of having my great parents who had experienced this society, who came from generations of knowing what to expect, who could share and model their coping skills and resilience, as well as their interventions, I was fortunate. Had my own family, my own experiences within a Black community, although only part-time on Sundays, not greatly assisted me with issues around my own identity, culture, and sense of being a citizen of this country, what might have happened. I share this with you because it could have turned out differently if I had not had a family versed in Canadian society and strong connections to a Black community. Sadly, this is not the case for many Black Canadians now. And so they find family in other places and they find identity in other places. And often it's a negative identity. There was harm caused by not talking about race and racism. I have shared this with you because I wanted you to know, to be reminded about the harm that racism causes people. It's not something out there that's, this abstract, weird thing. It's real and it hurts people. Regular people who happen to be Black, Asian, others, but Black. I have been harmed. My parents, their parents have been harmed. My children have been harmed. This moment in our history is an ideal time to deal the harm caused and to prevent further harm from happening. It is a time to heal the harm. Educators have an obligation to confront the harm of racism. We have an obligation to confront the harm of racism. This is why we must, I hope, commit to becoming anti-racist and to preparing our young people to be anti-racist. You are ideally placed to influence the changes that could make a difference and to open up those very brave conversations and support systemic changes that can help. Now, a little bit more about me. What have I done? I mean, I didn't just complain about, oh my gosh, I've been harmed. I had to do something, and I found myself joining an organization that you've probably heard about. And even that was influenced by systemic racism, because my professional qualifications didn't matter when I would get interviews for jobs to work in the field that I had chosen and had been trained for. People who were Black were not going to be hired to work with their particular client population. And going through this over and over again, I got to a point where I just realized that I would volunteer. It wasn't exactly a first choice, but I'd rather volunteer and do something meaningful and purposeful than work in a coffee shop just to have money. It just didn't make sense to me at the time. So what did I do? I joined an organization called the Ontario Black History Society, and this was around the time that I had 2 children, and by the time I had my 3rd child and I was at home with him, I became the president. I wasn't aiming to be the president. I got to a board meeting early and I was voted in. So it was not like I had been strategizing and planning and clawing and scraping, hoping to get the position, which was not paid, was a volunteer position. But anyway, I became president in 1993, and during that time, it was in the fall, and there wasn't a perfect changeover. So we realized almost too late that we had not gone to the city of Toronto to ask them for a proclamation for Black History Month. We didn't know we had to ask every year. We thought that when Dan Hill and everyone else had set things up, it was there forever. So I did that, and then realized that this could be lost so easily. And this is more important than just being a Toronto thing. So I went to the province of Ontario. I went to every province across the country and got a Black History Month proclamation. Then I went to the federal government to get their support. In the meantime, I was doing hundreds of Black history presentations in schools to raise awareness and build up a community of support. Went to the federal government, and ultimately it came to Jean Augustine, and she supported it and helped to champion the National Declaration of February as Black History Month. So that was quite amazing that happened. And I have to admit that I thought, with all that pressure and with that community of interest I had helped to create myself personally, that we would then see Black history education in our schools from kindergarten to graduation. It didn't happen. We're still waiting. So 2020 on, this is a picture, if you can see the picture of slide 9, that's a picture of the 20th anniversary when MP Melanie Joly and MP Selena Cesar gave Jean Augustine and I a bit of an award there. And the first picture you may have seen in the previous slide was me presenting something to the Prime Minister at the time. I was the only non-elected person allowed to be part of that first celebration of Black History Month across Canada. So 2021 will mark the 25th anniversary of the first national celebration. I've worked to create curriculum units, and I've written books on Black history. I have just succeeded in having August 1st declared Emancipation Day across Canada, which I've been working on since 1995. And all of this is to hopefully make it more normal and possible to talk about race, racism, anti-Black racism in our history. Just a quick one. This is a map of the world, slide 10. And in this particular projection, I'm a very visual person. That's why I wanted to do this PowerPoint, whatever. It makes it look like, you know, Asia and Africa are sort of, but, you know, Europe is really big. But the more meaningful and better balanced projections show how incredibly immense the continent of Africa really is. And that is something that even visually, even in terms of maps, the representation of Black people or the place where Black people are known to have come from was minimized. And just a quick reminder, as much as George is amazing, and of course I'm amazing, Black history doesn't begin with us, nor does it begin in Canada. It does begin in Africa. And it's important for us to remember that prior to the enslavement of Africa, Africa was flourishing. Africa was flourishing. There were several great kingdoms in Africa that existed before enslavement. Slavery interrupted our greatness. Egypt was one of the major civilizations. I'm seeing I'm taking up too much time here. And you know, the Sphinx and the pyramids. We have the Nubian civilization, which included the communities of Kush and Merowe and had all kinds of resources in terms of gold and iron. And the Nubians also created the second oldest writing system in the world, in Africa. There was in the Ghanaian Empire, there was a university called Sankore in Timbuktu, the university in Timbuktu. And it had a library containing between 400,000 to 700,000 items. There were real Wakandas. If you saw the movie The Black Panther, they show this amazing place where there was so much amazing development. And while, of course, there is no real Wakanda, the idea of a Wakanda where Africans were able to have learning and wealth and excellence, those things did exist. I'm just going to run through a couple more slides before I stop, because I think some of it, George, thank you, George, for doing this. But here's a map, slide 13, of the transatlantic slave trade. And well, essentially from Europe, people would go to Africa with manufactured goods and guns, and they would trade those for the gold. Initially, that was a big important commodity, but later it became trading those items for African bodies. Africans were then shipped across the Atlantic, going into South America, going into the Caribbean, and going into the United States. Slave vessels generally weren't docking in Canada, but enslaved people, as you know, came in with their owners, came in as runaways, came in with the loyalists, came in at different points in time from the United States or the Caribbean, or sometimes even from Britain. And then from the drop-off of enslaved people in the Americas, these same ships, which were making money on every rung of their voyage, would go back to Europe with some of the manufactured goods that they would pick up in the New World, including sugar, molasses, and so on. So it was just a profitable venture. And when slavery ended, it was possible for an African person to be free, but really to be incredibly disadvantaged, which we've already heard. And I think that it's important, though, that we begin to learn about issues of race and equity early, in an age-appropriate manner. Kids can tell colors apart before they're even 2, real early, you know, so that they can begin to develop their own awareness of injustice. Maybe I'll just stop here because, well, actually, let me talk about Viola Desmond. She's on your $10 bill, and this is slide 17. And while we talk about when Black history is taught, sometimes we do hear so much about Rosa Parks, and I met her. She was a lovely, beautiful, fragile, delicate person. You would never believe that she could have come to mean so much to so many people. But Rosa Parks was somebody who did what she did almost 10 years after someone right here in Canada did something as important, and we don't talk about it. So our own story is hidden from us in our own country. And maybe I'll just, so let's see if I've got one more slide here. I can't read my own slides. So what we cannot address what we cannot assess. If we don't talk about it, we can't do anything about it. If we stay silent about something, nothing will change. And we have to find ways to talk about things. I think it's important, and I know I'm going over time a bit, but I think it's important to just say that right now, the Black population in Toronto is about 8.8%, but somehow we represent 42.5% of people who are involved in obstruct justice charges, which is almost 5 times more. A Black person is 5 times more likely to be charged. Why? And the reason for that is that Black people tend to be overwatched, surveilled. Black people are given fewer opportunities to negotiate their charge. But it's always why. A Black person in Toronto, which is critical mass or had been critical mass of all Black people in the country, is 20 times more likely to be shot and killed by police. So this isn't just, it isn't just about important things like being nice. It isn't just about helpful things like learning about other people. It isn't just about ideal things like being hired in a profession that you're trained in so you can actually get paid and be self-sufficient. It's also about your life. Black students are suspended at 3 times the rate of non-Black students. Black Canadians face greater food insecurity, and Black Canadians face steeper economic challenges than white Canadians. Black Canadians are nearly twice as likely as non-racialized Canadians to be considered low income. And it doesn't really matter if people have been in this country. My family has been in this country since 1783. in terms of the entire community, how my family, how I fare in relation to people who've been here for, it doesn't matter. Being here for, as George ably pointed out, the disadvantage, it's always a disadvantage for people. And I'm just trying to race through here.
Thank you so much, Rosemary.
I know I'm so bad with the time. I had,
it's okay, because we had some little bit of fun with technology. so you're good there.
Okay, I'm going to stop. I do have something that we can bring up later, if I can find it, and it was, it had to do with the Butterfly Collective, I think they're called.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And thank you so much for what you have done for the Black community and for Canada.
You're welcome.
My heart was broken when you talked about your daughter was not invited to that birthday party. It was really heartbreaking. And you're amazing, like to bring it, up to the federal level, this commemoration of February as Black History Month.
I can see you all now. Thank you. Thank you, Yang.
Yeah. So like what are some of the major barriers when you did this, and how did you manage that? Like, what are the most important factors that make it successful?
In terms of having a Black History Month?
Because you've gone to the province, you've gone to the parliament. What were the barriers you have encountered?
I would say Black History Month was a bit different than Emancipation Day. Black History Month, I would say that I'm just going to say this. I think that the threat level was different. The concern was different. It just came at the right time. So it was something that had been actually taking place in the city of Toronto since 1950, but not something that was declared. It had been something that had been taking place in the United States since the 1920s. So people had been aware of it. And I think that the invitation for it to become more of a mainstream or a broader community involved event, to invite white people to be part of it, did not happen until the first proclamation of February as Black History Month with the City of Toronto, that Dr. Daniel G. Hill and Wilson O'Brooks and Joan Kazmarski and everybody at the OBHS was able to secure. So by the time I did it, I mean, the world had changed again, and they got their declaration in 1979. I'm coming in now in 1993. My son was a year old. Things were different. The population had grown again. We were now seeing not just the people who had come into Canada following the change in the immigration laws in the 60s. We were now we were having Canadian-born, first-generation Caribbean Canadians in particular, and they had different interests and different demands. So I think that it was a way of wanting to address the reality of the Black population, particularly in the city of Toronto, and it was easier for that to happen. With the other provinces, I think that they just did it because, oh well, they couldn't anticipate why it could be a problem or not a problem. And I know that I remember the moment when I actually spoke with Jean Augustine at an event after having already written and faxed. Yes, we had faxes and phoned all kinds of different MPs. She was somebody I happened to run into because we also had a Black senator, Ann Cools, who I think I had approached as well. But I saw Jean at an event, and she went and spoke to a Black lawyer, Lloyd Perry, and I guess he convinced her that it would be a good thing for her to do, and she agreed to do it. So it made it happen because she could see she was able to work on a community of interest that was already there. Emancipation Day was a completely different thing. I have been working on that since 1995. There was opposition through omission. So every party, every political party at some point has had their hand on this bill. The Reform Party, I mean, just talking about nationally, the Reform Party supported it. The Conservative Party supported it. I mean, I didn't have a cell phone in those days. Me and Preston Manning, because I approached this in a nonpartisan way. And it's gone to second reading, well, depending on how you count it, 3 times in the House of Commons and twice in the Senate before it finally came back and was passed this particular time just this week. So I think it's because some people may feel that with an acknowledgement of the end of slavery, there might come other, George knows, other demands. And I kept it simple. I'm just asking for you to acknowledge Emancipation Day, but there are other things I fully expect to see happen.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing. So how do you see the dynamics of the Black community now in Canada? So you just mentioned there are different groups of Black people. So how do you see the dynamics and their different needs, or how do you see the challenges and opportunities for Black community as a whole in this country?
I have to be hopeful all the time, even though, you know, I see what I see. I think, you know, we still have, I mean, this is part of the unfortunate legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. We still, and colonialism and systemic racism, we still have people who don't see themselves as being people of African descent. They don't have a clear identity of who they are. They don't have an appreciation for their ancestral history or their history in this country. There are people who deal with internalized racism, and as George pointed out, look down upon African Canadians. And sometimes it's in quite profound and divisive ways. So we still have those challenges, but I think that, you know, we still have to, it's like you just have to keep moving because there are always going to be challenges. There are always going to be detractors and dissenters and haters, right? So you know what's important and you aim to do that for the benefit of the community, even if you don't have buy-in from all of the community. If you're doing it for the good of the community, not the good of yourself, because that skews things in very bizarre ways. But if you're doing something that is truly for the benefit of the community, it doesn't matter.
And George, do you have something to say about that? Like what kind of challenges and opportunities the Black community is facing, and like maybe some solutions that's on your mind to solve the problems?
First of all, I want to thank Rosemary for a very complete examination of how we got to where we are and the challenges that persist. I also want to congratulate her at this moment too for all the hard work over decades to have more Canadians, more Ontarians recognize the saliency of Black history. And now I'm going to try to come to your question, Yang. And it goes like this. One of the things that we all need to recognize about Black Canada is that we're not just one group. Because of the different waves of immigration, going back to the 17th century, 18th century, and so on, and then even in the 20th century, up to the present, different groups of Black people arrived in what is now Canada at different times under very different conditions. And this also, so this means, number one, that we are a multicultural community within a country that prides itself on being multicultural. That's very important for us all to understand, because one reason why Black Canadians have had a harder time making ourselves heard and making our needs respected is because we have not been able to speak, frankly, often with one voice, because of the fact that we have so many different ethnicities, so many different national origins, not to mention the whole French-English thing. You know, a doctor who immigrates to Canada from Cote d'Ivoire doesn't necessarily have a lot in common, or may not think that he or she has much in common with a Black Canadian who's been born and raised in Nova Scotia and who may be working class or may be poor or may simply be a high school graduate. He or she or they, the doctor from Cote d'Ivoire and let's say the Black youth from North Preston, Nova Scotia, maybe both walking down the same street here in Toronto with the police or somebody else saying, oh, look, there are two Black people, but those two Black people may not actually see each other as necessarily having much in common. And that's particularly true. If you're a Black immigrant coming to Canada from a majority Black country, you do not grow up thinking of yourself as being Black. If you're from Africa, Black Africa, especially, everybody's Black. So it doesn't make any sense for people to differentiate on the part of skin color. We have lots of memoirs and statements of Black immigrants from Africa who point out that they never learned anything about being Black until they arrived in Canada or North America or the United States and had white people tell them, oh, you're Black, or had other Black people tell them, you're Black. Because where they originate, Blackness doesn't have any real importance because everybody is, and this makes perfect sense. If you're not a minority based on being a visible minority, a minority based on color, and so on, there's no reason for you to think about it. You're going to worry about other things. Africans can be divided on the basis of religion, on the basis of class, and so on, but not necessarily on the basis of color, because this is why everybody basically has the same range of shades. And so this adds to the complexity of Black identity in Canada. I like to talk about the fact that Black Canadians don't just have, and this is something that makes us different from Black Americans. Black Canadians don't just have one identity. We have a whole lot of identities. There's our own ethnic identity. If we happen to be from another nation originally, we have a national identity connected to the homeland where we may have originated. We have our national identities being Canadians. We have our regional identities because a Black from Quebec and a Black from British Columbia and a Black from Nova Scotia and a Black from urban Ontario all have different experiences. Keep in mind the fact that the provinces have control over education. This is very important because what this means is that the provincial education systems have a role in modeling how their Black citizens see themselves, see each other, and whether or not they ever think about Black people in any other part of the country. So for instance, this has real ramifications, and it goes to, again, notions of unity. If Black people have issues, even in Ottawa, around police, it's very difficult to raise support effectively from Black people, even in Toronto, let alone in Montreal, let alone in Charlottetown, and we can go across the country. If a Black person in Edmonton has issues with the justice system, with the school system, it's difficult then to say to Black Francophone speakers in Quebec, well, you've got to come and help us. And the same way for them. They may have difficulty saying to Black English speakers, you better come help us out here in Montreal or in Quebec City or in Trois-Rivières because of our issues. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a double-sidedness to Black Canadian existence, which is, on the one hand, I think it's incredibly rich and dynamic that we are not just one people, that we are multifaceted, that we have many, represent many languages and religions and have different cultural experiences in different parts of the country and so on. And that makes us a very dynamic and artistically vibrant community, for crying out loud. And at the same time, that's true, we also need to do a better job ourselves. And that's why Black Lives Matter and those movements are so important in helping to create. And Rosemary's work is so important in helping to create a national dialogue that allows us to speak across our ethnic and subnational and regional and linguistic and religious differences so that we can work collectively to achieve the changes that we need to achieve. I want to say very quickly, I'll explain something else very quickly. Why is it, what makes us different from the United States, from African Americans, even though many Canadians will presume that we are all automatically West Indian, or we are all automatically African, or we are all automatically African American. The difference, once again, has to do with history and also the relationship to the government, the relationship to the state. The American Constitution, as it stands now, is based on the presence of African Americans, first as slaves, then as free people. African Americans have impacted, affected every constituent element of the United States. Even if there are white supremacist, racist Americans who hate the fact, none of them can get away from the fact that their very country is based on African people and their servitude, their culture, their armed services, and also the fact that African Americans have influenced Americans because they have their own historically Black colleges, universities, their own media, their own entertainment empires, their own churches and temples and mosques and synagogues, for that matter, and so they become a kind of sub-civilization of the United States. African Canadians don't have that kind of background and that kind of impact on the national state. In terms of cities, in terms of provinces like Nova Scotia, yes, there can be some of that here in Ontario as well. But the Canadian state is based more on the competition between Anglophones and Francophones and the attempt to marginalize Indigenous people. These are the constituent factors that create Canadian history, whereas African Americans are absolutely integral to every part of American history. So these are ways to help understand differences, but I also want to be positive and say this. Because of the struggles of people like Rosemary, the late Rocky Jones, the late Howard McCurdy, and George McCurdy, and Daniel Hill, and Wilson Hitt, and so many others, Bromley Armstrong, et cetera, and across the country, so many Black men and women have fought hard to open up immigration, not just for Black people, but for everybody. That was a huge struggle, because you should know, and I got to point this out, Canada had anti-Asian, anti-Black, anti-Jewish immigration laws for 50 years, from 1905 to 1955. For 50 years, if you were Asian, if you were Black, if you were Jewish, you did not have an automatic possibility of becoming a citizen of Canada. That was by order in council. It was done secretly. It wasn't done before the courts. It was done behind closed doors. That Canada decided it was going to try to be a white man's country, that it was not going to allow visible minority others or Jews to immigrate to this country. So we need to understand these basic facts of the structure of the society, and to understand the ways in which Black people campaigned in the 1940s and into the 1950s to create the possibility for immigration based on merit, to blast open those doors. I mean, one thing we got to remember is that Canada never had an Emma Lazarus poem or a Statue of Liberty in any harbor to say, hey, everybody's welcome. Bring your huddled masses. You're all welcome to come here. We never did. Canada is a monarchy. That means that we are selective. If you've got a monarchy, you've got a hierarchy. We only want the best, the brightest, and the richest, and the healthiest. The best, the brightest, the richest, and the healthiest. If you don't fit in one of those categories, you're not welcome. And that's the real history of Canadian immigration, because it's a hierarchical system, right? So the fact that Black people were instrumental in opening up immigration for everybody as of post-1955 is something important for us to keep in mind. But I also want to recognize or accent once again, being positive, that Canada is blessed with a richly diverse Black community from all over the world, from Africa, from the West Indies, from Brazil, from the United States, of course, African minority populations from Europe, as well as from African or Black peoples from Polynesia, South Pacific, Australia, Papua New Guinea, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a polyglot, multicultural Black community that should be the envy of all other Black communities on the planet, and a community that should be embraced and loved by the government of Canada and by other Canadians as well. And I know I'm going over the top here a little bit, but I do think, as Rosemary's work has proven, there is much to celebrate. I'm very pleased that with the current generations of youth of all backgrounds in Canada, that we are developing a much more visible minority, people of color, bourgeoisie, people of color, middle class, people of color, upper class. And ideally, if you really have a society that's based on meritocracy, I'm being positive here, I'm being positive. Eventually, because the cream rises to the top, we are going to end up with a country where the prime minister is Indigenous, where the governor general is Indigenous, the prime minister is Chinese, Canadian, the governor general is South Asian Canadian. The heads of corporations begin to look like the Toronto subway, begin to look like the TTC, as opposed to the TTC being composed of people of color as workers going to work in the office buildings of Bay Street and so on. The day is coming when we are going to control those corporations. The day is coming when the head of the World Bank of Canada will be Rosemary Sadlier. I'm just kidding.
Why not?
You're so passionate. It's interesting, like there are so many diverse groups, like subgroups within Black communities. And I think that's a beautiful thing as well, as if every subgroups can bring out their beautiful parts, the culture, music, and it will contribute to the beauty of the whole society. And as Rosemary said earlier, she got encouraged by those enriched culture of Black community. And talking about the youth, Christina, do you have some questions like from the youth, young people here in the community? Do you have some questions for our guest speakers?
I think Christina had to go. Okay, here's a question. People usually say Canada is better than the United States for racism and discrimination. Is it due to the Black immigrant history to Canada, differences in Black immigrant history? And yes, in a way, and no, in a way. I mean, I think that we've kind of covered that. There's so many different reasons why Canada is a bit different than the United States, but racism is racism is racism. In terms of Black history, do you think there is enough awareness in the public education? No. No. If that's the whole point of public education, it's the common denominator, the common socializer, the way that we all come to know what it's like to be close to people who are like us or not like us, rich, poor, fat, skinny, able, disabled, different religions. How do you come to know? How do you begin to form your own opinions if you haven't been exposed to the material? When my kids go home, what they find on the, well, this is, my kids are adults now, but what are they going to find on the shelves? What are they going to find on the shelves in your house? Who comes over to your house for dinner? Where do you go when you go to see theater? Like that's the point of school. It isn't just learning how to count and read well. It's also coming to understand the complexities of this society and being okay with that. So when they grow up and they are looking to hire people, they have everybody on their Rolodex, ideally, Rolodex, old term, they know what it means to be with a person who's Jewish. They know what it means to be with a person who's Muslim. They know what it means to be with a person who's Black, and they understand that they are not maybe that different than they are. So we do everyone a disservice when we don't have that kind of exposure in our public system. Another question, I don't know. Do you think all races can stand together against racism, against the racism incidents that will help to improve? Well, systemic racism is a challenge, but I think we've talked about this, that there's potential for standing together and there's potential for allyship. I'm just, because of the time I'm shooting through here. Mm-hmm. Why do people need slaves as servants? Why can't they do it by themselves? We know why. I think we know why after tonight, if we didn't know before. Stop Asian hate. What do you think would be the best approach in Canada? I think we've talked about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We covered a little bit.
Somebody commenting on how it's shocking that children were hurt. I guess they were talking about the same thing you mentioned, Yang, about, mm-hmm. But it did happen. And there were so many other things, but that's just one I mentioned. I think that's all the questions. I think we managed to do it. So
well, thank you very much. We hear like strong voices and touching stories from you. Very good opportunity for us to learn about the history and the condition. I think we can learn a lot from you. Wow, it's just wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. This has been great, and great to be on the same stage with you, Rosemary.
It was wonderful. We have to do this again.
Yeah. So yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that there are, you know, as I'm thinking, you know, we're having a private meeting in front of all of you, but you know, when you consider that we are so very similar, but yet we have managed not to be able to work together before, it's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you, Yang, for bringing us together in this way.
Sure. My pleasure. I'm very much honored that you can come. Yeah. Thank you.